and welcome to the Keys to Therapy. Today's guest is Michelle. Hey, Michelle.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I feel like there's a lot about this topic I don't know. So I feel like I'm going to learn something today too, which is exciting. So,
Okay, I'll do my best.
well, before we get too into the topic, do you want to tell the audience just a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Michelle Davis. My practice is inner window counseling, and I work with adults in North Carolina. I could also see people telehealth in South Carolina. My populations are grief and loss
Mhm.
and also adult ADHD. So that's what I'm here to talk about today. And I really, really enjoy working with both of those populations so much. They're both very close to my heart.
Yeah, and I feel like both of them are ones that, again, people don't necessarily know a lot about or don't totally know how to help. So I
Mm,
feel like this topic in particular, I don't even remember hearing the term neurodivergent until much later in life. Um, so I think that it's still something that there's a lot of new information coming out about. So I'm again excited for today. But before we get into those questions, I want to know a little bit about your journey. So, why did you decide to become a therapist?
yeah, absolutely. Great question. Yeah, so I had experiences within my own family, as I think a lot of therapists have, with members of my family who were struggling with their own mental health,
Mhm.
sometimes addiction. And as a kid, I was a really curious kid. I always wanted to know why about everything. It didn't matter what it was. Why was always going to be my first question. And so when I applied that sort of curiosity to try to understand sort of what I was seeing around me with my family dynamics, it led me into psychology. And I was hooked immediately. Is one of my special interests, I guess you could say. I just was so immediately fascinated with how critical mental health is and how mental health impacts like every aspect of our lives. And just from then on, I was probably about 12 or 13 at that time. And from just then on, I knew I wanted to be a therapist and I wanted to help people find that sense of mental wellness.
Oh, yeah, it's amazing. So, having that personal connection, I think, helps a lot too, probably with your
Hmm.
clients as well, because when you've had those personal experiences and then you're able to combine them with like the book formal
Hmm.
experiences, I feel like it can
Hmm.
make you a really good therapist. So, it's
Yeah.
awesome. Well, for people, like I said, the neurodivergent term in itself it feels newer. Maybe it's just spoken about more lately, but feels like it's something that's emerging. So, can you explain a little bit about what it means to be neurodivergent?
Yeah. I think you're definitely, onto something there. Neurodivergence is, maybe not a brand new term, but I think the cultural conversation about it has gotten a lot more, present and prevalent, which is a great thing. But also, our information is continuing to evolve and change. So there's different ways that people define neurodivergence. Of just in general, I would say it's a way of describing variations within both the structure and functioning of the brain. So that's where the neuro and neurodivergence comes from. So people with ADHD and autistic people have neurodivergent brains in that they process information and they perceive sensory cues and communicate and other functions in a way that's just unique to neurodiversity, not only as individuals, but as that kind of neurodiverse umbrella. And it's different from a neurotypical person. So somebody who is not neurodivergent is considered to be neurotypical, and so this can lead to having some different challenges, but also a lot of different strengths. And I think because of that, in addition to kind of the clinical definition of neurodiversity, it's also taken on in recent years sort of an identity quality about it. Because neurodiverse people, are and have been always, but I think with emerging technology and social media, now more than ever, building really community around being neurodivergent and their unique way of being in the world.
I like that because I feel like people historically who are neurodivergent were treated as other or maybe not as smart or less than
Mhm,
in some way or singled out.
mhm,
So I can
mhm.
remember back to elementary school, people being like, "Oh, that kid just never sits in a seat. He's so disruptive." And it was always a negative connotation for these
Yeah.
symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're completely right. And I think a lot of neurodiverse people, also because of how neurodiversity impacts, your social functioning and the way you process social information and social cues, it definitely has led to a lot of othering for people. And so finding that community, I think, feels really affirming that not only, am I not alone in this, but um, you know, there's I think this growing sense of um this is a system that really isn't built for us. And I say us, I have ADHD myself.
Mhm,
Um and so it's not always our way of relating that is,
mhm.
wrong. It's not a right or wrong. It's just that the system itself was not designed for us. And so finding community within that and pushing back against that kind of neuronormative stance, I think is really empowering for people.
Oh, yeah, and like you said with social media too, I think that's the best part of it probably is that community
Mhm.
that people can
Yeah.
watch videos. I know a lot of social media gets a bad rap, but if I've had clients even that have said like, "Oh my gosh, I need to send you this TikTok of this person because they're
Mhm.
describing how I felt. I just didn't know how to say it." And
Yes.
I think that community again, it's huge because then people are even sometimes, and this gets iffy, but sometimes kind of self-diagnosing to a certain extent or coming to therapy because of some of
Mhm.
the things they've saw where they're like, this kind of sounds or feels like me. So can you help me decide or discuss or diagnose if this is accurate or not?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and self-diagnosis is a topic that is talked about in neurodiverse communities, because formal diagnosis is not always accessible for
Mhm.
people. There's the financial aspect of it. There's the time commitment that comes with you're working 40 hours a week, and so it just there can be a lot of barriers to
Mhm.
formal diagnoses. But because neurodiversity is not just a clinical definition, but also a way of being in the world, there it highlights that lived experience part. So I think, what you're talking about are clients who have found other people who are
Mhm.
speaking to their lived experience. And it's important to listen to that and to not dismiss that out of hand as, well, you don't have a degree, you don't know what you're talking about because this is somebody's lived experience. So listening with an open mind, I think, is the foundation of what you need when you're wanting to work with people who are neurodiverse.
Yeah, and that goes right into my next question, which is why do you think it's important for therapists to understand what neurodivergence is, but also how it shows up? Because I know that
Mhm.
wasn't really talked about in any of my program.
Mhm.
And that wasn't, I mean, like a decade ago, but still like it wasn't that long ago and it still wasn't talked about. Maybe in like the DSM class, they were like, here's a little bit about ADHD and here's the types. And that was it. So,
Mhm.
yeah, so I think a lot of therapists probably have these big gaps in knowledge in this area. So, why do you think it's important for them to learn more about this?
Yeah, great question. So the main reason I think it's important is because neurodiversity, so for example, ADHD and autism, which are two of the more common forms of neurodiversity, they can present like mental health disorders. So, with us kind of talking about neurodiversity as a way of being in the world,
Mhm.
we really want to move away from pathologizing it. Again, it brings its own challenges, but we're trying to get away from kind of pathologizing it. But it can present like mental health disorders when it is not being addressed or treated. And so, for example, ADHD burnout, which is really common. It can cause symptoms that look like depression,
Mhm.
but that depression is not going to respond to traditional depression treatment if the ADHD is also not being acknowledged and factored in as part of that person's story and experience. So because of that, if you're not aware of neurodiversity and how it first shows up, you can be misdiagnosing your clients, which means they're not really going to be getting the treatment that's most effective for them. Or can feel frustrating for them because they're trying to apply interventions
Mm.
that should be working, but they're not working. And so misdiagnosis is a huge part. The second thing I would say is that when you are not informed of neurodiversity, but you're working with neurodiverse clients, you can be, unintentionally perpetuating stigma
Mm.
about neurodiversity. Particularly if the therapist is neurotypical, but this can also happen with internalized ableism, even with a neurodiverse clinician. But that perpetuating of that stigma, because the way that we are taught, I think, to think about a client's motivations and a client's attitudes and their response to interventions, um, sometimes it has this almost inherent pathological undertone to it, and that's a whole other discussion that we could talk about for hours, I'm sure. But if you're interpreting your clients, motivations through a particular lens, it can be seen as being resistant to the process,
Mhm.
or not committed to the process, or like they have a psychological block there. When in fact it might be something neurobiological that's happening with them. And so it's really going to impact um, how you respond to the client and how the client responds to you.
Oh, yeah. And I think particularly for newer therapists who maybe most of their experience has been that formal education and possibly, like a practicum or internship, but even within that, because this isn't talked about as much, or like you said, maybe pathologized a lot, it's difficult because I feel like you're sort of most people are sort of trained to look at the DSM criteria and be like, this is where you fit. This is where you fit.
Mhm,
And something you
mhm,
said earlier about lived experience is huge. And
mhm.
I know I make it a point to tell clients, like, I mean, I've got the book learning, your entire life.
Yeah.
So, I mostly want to hear from you. I need to know
Mhm,
what your experiences have been because I think those one need to be validated, but also the criteria is only going to take you so far. They're very broad strokes and these things show up very differently for people. So, I think that you're right in that the system could potentially be a lot better than it actually is. But I think maybe it sounds like overall what you're saying too is to look outside of the box of the traditional diagnostic criteria and really listen to the person and their experiences.
yeah, absolutely. Which I know can be, hard at first maybe to develop that capacity as a new therapist because when you come out of school, what you're leaning on is what they taught you in school.
Mhm.
And you have, your internships and things like that, but you haven't had enough experience with enough clients yet to look at those broad strokes sometimes. And so it can be a difficult thing to develop, but it is important to really flex those muscles of, as, think about like, okay, what is my job here? Like, my job is not to just put people in boxes and categorize
Mhm.
them. My job is to provide for them some of the things that they may not be getting in other areas of their life, like validation. And
Mhm.
so, it's don't you hear this, I think, in grad school too, and sometimes it sounds a little cliche maybe, but don't underestimate the importance of validation and empathetic listening and all of these just like base therapist skills.
Oh yeah, because that has to be first. But I think
Mhm.
also depending on where you work, and if you take insurance or not, there's so many different levels of it. But sometimes there can be that pressure, especially when you're new, to get all the questions of the assessments done and to come out with that diagnosis so that you could bill for it and code it and like all
Yes.
these things. And
Yes.
so I think that, like you were saying, this is definitely something to maybe if that criteria that you're given to complete the assessment doesn't include questions that might be relevant to this
Mhm.
population, possibly include
Mhm.
them then. Because I think most
Mhm.
traditional assessments don't really talk much about this. It might be like, what's your childhood like? But they mean more emotional. They mean more
Hmm.
like family structure, not necessarily learning styles, or if there was any difficulties or things along those lines where maybe it would have popped up at an earlier stage.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with you.
Yeah, I know when I worked with the military, the last like couple years, they had us give everybody what they called a learning needs assessment. So it
Mm,
would be, I can't remember all the questions exactly, but basically it was to assess, do they need things written to understand? Do they need it verbally?
mm,
Do they need something
mhm,
tactile? And that ended up being
mhm.
we had to incorporate in our assessment. And the government traditionally is really slow with a lot of this stuff. But that was one thing that I was like, oh, okay, guys, like you're showing up today. Like this is great.
Yeah.
And I wish that that was maybe a part of, I guess, the standard assessments, but also maybe things that were done in school too, so people could get diagnosed earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Learning style is something that is critical to take into consideration, and I think becomes even more important when you're talking about things like neurodiversity because we don't all process information in the same way.
Mhm.
Hearing something, seeing something with a visual, doing something, in a kind of practical way, all of those things, if you can learn how to incorporate them into your interventions, it's definitely going to make you a better therapist because you're going to be adapting to the client's needs.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, what steps do you think that new therapists should take in order to just kind of increase their knowledge and awareness of this topic?
Hmm. Yeah, so training is, of course, always, important in any topic that you're wanting to learn more about. But specifically with trainings in this area, something that can be tricky and important to evaluate is the training presented in a neuroaffirming way?
Mm,
And is it not perpetuating, these stereotypes about neurodiversity? So it's ideal if you can seek out trainings that are given by folks who are neurodiverse themselves, clinicians who also have that lived experience. Because for such a long time, all of our information on neurodiversity was coming from um, neurotypical sources,
mhm.
and so it was being filtered through that lens. And so you kind of get this outside in view.
Yeah.
But when that happens, you're going to be making interpretations. And so when you can get it from an inside out view, you get a much more complete picture. So, I would say as important as seeking out that formalized training and that supervision is, um, one of the things that you can do to increase your knowledge is listen to neurodiverse people
Mhm.
and get their perspectives and listen to their experiences, so that you can begin to challenge those inherent biases that we have. And we all have them, just like other types of forms of bias and stereotype. When you're living in a society that's built around isms,
Mhm.
those things are going to filter in, and we have to be active in looking for them in ourselves and challenging them in ourselves. Otherwise, we're just going to go along kind of with the status quo.
Yeah, and that reminds me, what you were saying earlier, I thought was really important about clients' motivations and
Mhm.
how I would think also for all therapists, but definitely newer therapists, if you're trying these interventions and you're like, this is my whole toolbox and it's not working, that it doesn't necessarily mean the client doesn't want to get better or reach those goals, or it doesn't mean that the tools aren't good. It's just them
Right.
maybe getting more creative potentially, or like you said, seeking supervision or
Mhm.
consultation might be the way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and really talking to your clients about, I think sometimes in therapy, it can be hard to develop this stance of like talking to the client about, we're not going to just talk about what's happening in your life. I also want to talk about this process. So
Yeah.
how is this process for you? I want you to give me feedback. And it's hard because I think when you're a young therapist, a new therapist, you are already fighting so much imposter syndrome
Oh, yeah.
that it can be hard to talk to the client and say, I know that not everything I'm going to bring to you is going to work for you, and I want you to tell me that, and to not take that personally, but you have to. And so if you find that an intervention, is running into issues, talking with the client about, what specific part of this felt hard for you.
Mhm.
And maybe we can modify that, but also, maybe we just pivot and we look at something else because, I want you to know that if deep breathing, for example, like meditation, we all know the benefits of meditation. We all know how, crucial mindfulness is. But for a lot of neurodiverse folks, any type of sitting meditation, being quiet, being still is extremely hard for them.
Mm.
And what can be more effective is like a moving meditation. So, mindfulness as you're in motion.
Mm.
But if you don't really sit with your client and kind of get into the nitty gritty of like, where did you find these barriers? What was coming up for you? You may just think it's your lack of skills or it's their resistance, but
Yeah.
in reality, it's neither. It's just we need a different tool.
Yeah. Oh, I like that moving meditation. That is awesome because isn't like the whole premise supposed to be like meet your client where they're at? But
Yes.
I think that's what we're told, but I wasn't given a lot of suggestions on how to put that into practice.
Mm-hmm.
It felt like
Mm-hmm.
a catchphraise, like not
Yeah.
necessarily anything concrete like that, which
Mm-hmm.
would be, ask them. I think whether it's like it's explicitly said or implicitly, like it's implied, we're all kind of taught or believe, I guess, to be the expert in the room.
Right.
And
Right.
so it's like you feel like you have to, especially newer, like you said, with that imposter syndrome, like you have to come in and have all the answers and know all the things. And when you don't, you get frustrated with yourself and sometimes
Mm-hmm.
frustrated with the client. And that's when I think a lot of
Yeah.
people start to question if this is the right
Yeah.
profession for them. But it's
Mm-hmm.
like you said, maybe being flexible, talking to the client, being like, look, this is what I know has worked for some people, but not everybody. So what style works best for you? And using their expertise because they're ultimately the expert on them.
Exactly. Exactly
Yeah.
right. Yes, I fall back on that. That was something that was really emphasized a lot in my social work program. And
Mm.
I fall back on that, all the time. Because I mean it also takes the pressure off.
Yeah.
You're there to, you're there to guide and you're there to support and you're there to present ideas. But ultimately the client is the one that decides which ideas land for them and which don't. And so it also takes that pressure off of you of having to be the one to solve the problem, fix the problem,
Mhm.
because that's not really our role. But I think that's why so many of us are drawn to this work because we want to help. We want to help
Yeah.
people fix their issues. But you know, overall, like I think it just sets you up for burnout when you expect yourself to be the one that's fixing everything.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, and I like being able, like you said, to ask the client what they need. How do they learn
Mhm.
best? If they're struggling, when you mentioned like ask them which part they were struggling
Mhm.
with. It's like, yeah, that's going to give you so much insight. It's not like you have to throw your entire toolbox out. It's just figuring out which pieces. Maybe you got to piecemeal some of it and see what works
Mhm.
best. But I have another question that's related that I just thought of. I remember, I know this has changed over the years, but a lot of formal things said you couldn't get diagnosed with ADHD or other things unless you'd had it as a kid. Like you couldn't get diagnosed as an adult unless you had that history as a kid. We know that
Mhm.
that's changed because not everybody's it's not gonna show up in the same way for everybody. So I was
Mhm.
curious about your thoughts during the assessment process, because I know that was the typical question. So is there anything that you ask in particular to assess for neurodivergence when you're going through your own assessments?
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess so a couple of things that I want to say about that. So I do have some like diagnostic assessment tools that I go through with my clients, especially if they're coming in and they're wondering. But I also have to kind of give them the caveat of a lot of times if you need something like medication or you need something like accommodations in your job or your school, you're probably going to have to go and get formalized
Mhm.
testing from a neuropsychologist. And so that's something that I would, talk with new therapists about. Use that as a resource. It doesn't mean that the client is not going to be working with you any longer, but they go and they get this testing, and then it just informs your work. But that being said, it's not accessible to everybody. So to answer your question about kind of the trajectory of somebody's life, it's also important to be aware of different ways that these symptoms can manifest,
Mhm.
because for so long, for example, with ADHD, so long we had the stereotype of, ADHD is something that, 10-year-old boys who can't sit down, or, they're talking too much in class, that's, how that looks. And
Yeah.
if it looks any different for you, then no, it's not ADHD. And I experienced this myself because I got diagnosed as an adult. I always did very well in school, because school was, sort of an escape for me, and it was something I was good at and I enjoyed it. But I was constantly leaving my belongings everywhere, and yeah, I had difficulty fitting in with peers. And so, particularly when you look at different gender expressions, different cultural contexts,
Mm.
these symptoms might be showing up in different ways. So while I think that it is true that, particularly with ADHD, it's a lifelong, disorder, and it does start earlier in your life, it might look different for different
Mhm.
people.
Yeah, and I think that's huge, and that's something that I've seen, again, only recently, really coming out of all the shades of how it can
Mhm.
look and how it does present different in different genders. I've heard with girls, it tends to be, like, up and away is more of how it'll show versus, like, maybe some of the disruption stereotypically that boys might show, or the daydreaming or zoning out may be another way that things present.
Mhm.
But it might look, like they don't care. So yeah, just kind of being aware of those things. And when potentially maybe when you're assessing clients and talking to them about childhood, sounds like maybe asking them more about difficulties they had in school, but with peers and different things as well, potentially versus just how are your grades?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, emotional dysregulation, that's another
Mhm.
thing, that's really important to assess for, and that's something that, isn't, I think, addressed as much in the DSM criteria, that
Yeah.
emotional dysregulation piece, but, it's actually a very critical and common piece.
Mm.
So, asking in that way, uh and, one of the things that you mentioned, like, how it tends to present in girls is, sort of up and away, even sometimes with that hyperactivity piece. So, talking a lot in class,
Mhm.
but that's something that, uh, with traditional gender norms, we almost expect more of
Yeah.
girls.
Yep.
and and so we don't look at that as something that could be indicative of a neurotype.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think it's just important to go beyond assumptions and really kind of talk to your clients about what was the experience of being of being young like for you, and what were the things that felt difficult, and sometimes that can give you clues into areas in which these things might be presenting that are not just textbook based.
Absolutely. And I thought of one more random question for you.
Mhm.
As we're talking, things are coming up. So it kind of combines both your specialties. And I'm thinking about this based off a client that I know that was not diagnosed till late 30s with ADHD. And there was
Mhm.
so much grief that came with that
Mhm.
diagnosis because I remember in particular them crying and saying, I thought I was stupid my whole life. People made fun of me, or my parents were frustrated with me, or teachers didn't like me. And to
Yeah.
get that diagnosis then, they were happy to get it and finally have clarity, but also there was so much grief involved. So since I know those are your two specialties, have you seen similar things?
Absolutely. Yeah, that comes up so often with people because, I think there's a sense of, if I had had this information earlier,
Yeah.
then, look at all these things that might not have been a struggle for me, or look at all these things that I could have interpreted in a different way, as opposed to there was something wrong with me.
Mhm.
Because it's not that, it's just being different. But yeah, that grief sense, and that's a part of, once we kind of get beyond helping people find strategies that work for them, that's a lot of times where the deeper emotional work
Mm.
is processing that grief, processing that shame. There's so much shame that can come with, these experiences, especially when you don't know what's going on.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, absolutely, feeling grief for, all of these years sort of lost in in that confusion when you could have had clarity.
Yeah. Yeah, I was curious because I feel like that probably comes up a lot. And it sounds like for you, maybe it seems like, helping them get the diagnosis first is big, right? Whether that's testing and stuff you guys are working on, and then coming up with those strategies to help them function better. Because that's typically what
Mhm,
brings them in, I would think. There's something that's
mhm,
not working well. And then, like you
mhm.
said, possibly then going into that deeper emotional work to help them figure out maybe where else it's shown up or giving themselves more of a break and figuring out how to rebuild from here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that self-compassion is such a powerful part of this work as well. Um, because, it, you have to kind of, I think a lot of times for folks who have ADHD, especially if they have flown under the radar,
Mhm.
because maybe they have been able to manage like more of like what their external life looks like, but
Yeah.
on the inside, there can be a lot of chaos. For those folks, there's been so much energy and effort and time put into basically trying to look neurotypical. I mean, masking
Mhm.
and people not finding out, how it actually looks on the inside for them or how it actually feels. And so that self compassion part comes into play of, I don't have to live up to somebody else's standards. There's going to be things in my life that are important for me to make sure that they're managed so that my
Mhm.
stress level is down. But if the best way that I can make sure that I have routinely have clean clothes for myself is to wash them and dry them, but then I pick them out of the laundry basket all week
Mhm.
long and I wear them like that. Um, there's nothing morally wrong about that.
Yeah.
One of my favorite people who kind of engage in this work, Casey Davis, she talks about the moral neutrality of care tasks,
Mhm.
but we don't look at it like that in society. A lot of times we do sort of assign these character values
Mm.
to what does your house look like, or do you have a healthy diet, or all of these kinds of things that can be difficult for people. So coming to that place of self-compassion of okay, there's some things that I want to work on, but there's other things that I can accept myself as I am. I'm not broken.
Yeah, and like you said, the goal isn't necessarily to conform to society standards. It's figuring
Right.
out how to best live within
Right.
these standards in a way that is still true to yourself. Because I think
Yeah.
some people, maybe clients, because of the messages they received, or therapists from the messages they've received, feel like then it's how do we put the square peg into this round hole? And that's
Right.
not going to work. And that's where that frustration can come through too. So I like that you say that. If, it's the clothes are clean, you're just getting them out of the pile in the chair or wherever they
Hmm.
live now, then that's fine. And I like how you said too, basically judgment. There's a lot of judgment, right? With it, this is the standard of how you're supposed to live. And some of that's from a place of privilege. Not
Yeah.
everybody has the time or capacity or want or any of that to be able to hold up that standard in every way all the time. So
Hmm.
yeah, it sounds like being kind to yourself is something to help with, like, help clients develop that self-compassion, like you mentioned too, and us have it for them instead of this is what activities of daily living look like. Again, all these lists and things that we're taught to measure by.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and helping clients to really kind of dismantle, okay, what are the rules that you're living by, and where'd you get those rules?
Yeah.
And are those really the rules that fit you the best, or that you want to continue to uphold? Because, like you said, a lot of times, what something is supposed to look like, quote unquote, supposed to look like, does come down from this place of privilege and assuming that everybody has the same capacity,
Mhm.
and we don't. So helping clients kind of challenge, you know where did this structure come from, and is it really the right structure for you?
Yeah, so that goes back to that inner work you were talking about as well. So that therapists should
Hmm.
really work on getting to maybe defining what those stereotypes are, those messages are, how they've been received and perceived and everything throughout the years. Because I think sometimes people may get kind of stuck with this population if they don't have the right understanding or training of, okay, well, now you're on medication, or now you have some strategies, we're good to go, instead of maybe really
Right.
diving into what all of this has meant for them and how they're feeling about it.
Yeah, absolutely. completely. Yeah, because I think it's a deeper knowledge of there's more than just surface level, strategies. Like strategies are not always going to perfectly work. And if you're trying to get to that place where you're doing everything um, perfectly right the first time, every time,
Hmm.
then is that strategy just a way to continue to further like, neuronormative standards?
Yeah.
So, there's a deeper conversation there than just helping people with task initiation. That's a part of it, but that's not where it ends.
Hmm. Yeah, and I like that because I feel like that's something that, again, you would need to know a lot about this population in order to do that deeper work as well and know which questions to ask instead of like,
Mhm.
oh, things seem like they're functioning better. Great. And kind of move on from there. Like there's so many layers, it sounds like, to even getting the diagnosis, let alone
Mhm.
figuring out what to do with it. That can be a lot.
Yeah.
So was there any additional tips you could think of for new therapists, either with working with this population or just in general when it comes to therapy?
Yeah, so I think that we, did kind of touch on it, but it probably bears repeating. Just to, validate and not dismiss out of hand when people come in and they say, I saw this TikTok or
Yes.
I watched this YouTube video or I read this Wikipedia. Um, to not just automatically kind of dismiss out of hand. Be thorough, in your diagnostic criteria because just as ADHD can look like other things can look like ADHD.
Right.
So, be thorough, but make sure that you're coming in with an open mind to listen to that client and how does this describe some part of their inner world,
Mhm.
that ultimately um, you don't have a window into. Like you said, they're the expert on themselves.
Yeah. Is that where the name came from for your practice?
Inner window.
Yeah.
Uh, so I went through like a gajillion names and they were all taken, and it took me so long to come up with something. And
Mhm.
I like, yeah, I like that idea of like inner insight, but then also I do brain spotting, and
Yes.
inner window is one of the techniques that you use in brain spotting.
Mhm.
So it's sort of a play on that. But yeah, man, I feel for anybody that's going through that process of trying to pick a name because it's not easy.
No, it's really not. Every variation of like certain there, I swear it'll be something with like water, and there's gonna be every
Mm.
variation you could think of with it, or any of the other things, I swear. So yeah, maybe if you're a newer therapist knowing you want to go to private practice, start working on the name like
Yeah, get that
sooner.
domain name locked in so
Yes.
nobody can take it.
Yeah, sooner than later. It's another little extra
Yeah.
tip there. But
Yes.
yeah, as you were talking, I was like, oh, your practice name. Like that makes so much sense. But that's really cool. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this today. I feel like I learned some other questions and things to ask as well for clients. So I'm hoping that this information will help fill some of the gaps that maybe kind of the broad education, which I get they can't cover everything, but I feel like maybe certain new therapists will be coming across clients and hopefully ask some more thorough questions and start looking for some different things besides the traditional DSM criteria.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about this. It's really important to me, so I just appreciate this platform and just sending solidarity to all the new therapists that are watching this. I have been there. I have felt the struggle that you're feeling, and so I have so much admiration for you coming into this and facing all of the inner work that you have to do to get to where you need to go. So yeah, I think this is really important work that you're doing, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, we got to help the newbies out. So I'm really big on paying it forward. And I created this. So it's almost like, people say be who you needed when you were younger. I wanted to
Yeah,
create the resources I needed when I was younger in my career. So I really
yeah.
appreciate you taking the time to contribute to that. It's awesome.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, for everyone watching, if you want to follow along, go ahead and subscribe so you can stay on top of future videos. I also have a Facebook group for new therapists so everybody can connect with each other. And there's an email list as well. So all that information is linked below. But I will see you guys next time. Thanks again, Michelle.
Thanks.
Bye.